What are Azerbaijan's objectives in its recent attacks on Armenia? To what extent are Armenian-Azeri relations being influenced by changing regional and international dynamics? Welcome to the first episode of the new season of Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Eric Hacopian. Eric Hacopian is a 30-year veteran of American politics, having worked on campaigns from the local to the presidential level. For the past 22 years, he has been the principal at EDH Associates, a Southern California-based democratic consulting firm. He has been living in Armenia since 2017. Eric Hacopian, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Eric, let's start with the series of recent Azeri attacks on Armenia, which started last month, which appear to have come out of the blue and have been directed at territory within Armenia's internationally recognized borders, rather than contested areas outside it. You've previously spoken of Azerbaijan's attempted Gazification of Armenia. What do you mean by this? And specifically, what is the background to these attacks? What are Azerbaijan's objectives? And to what extent are these being achieved?
Those are very good questions. First of all, I would say, I think it's a misnomer to use the phrase Azerbaijan. I think we need to clarify this, that these attacks, unfortunately, that given the political system in that country, the citizens have no say in such matters. There's one man that decides, and in fact, two families that pretty much own the country, him and his wife's family. So I think it's not fair to put this on the Azeri people. We need to sort of put this on the leadership, which is Ilhan Aliyev, who, by the way, if you count his dad's rule from the Soviet times, have been running that former republic and current country since 1969 with a very short interruption. To put it in the context, an Arab context, that makes them run, that actually makes them run in that country longer than the Assads have ruled Syria, to give you some sense of how that country is essentially, for political purposes or military decision-making purposes, the one man. And not
family dynasty.
Yes, we should not put this on the Azeri people. The purpose here is simple. Obviously, the genesis of this is the Karabakh issue, as Armenians called it, Artsakh. And the long-term plan of the Aliyev regime has been to recover the entire territory of Artsakh or Karabakh, which Armenians have been living in for thousands of years, and ethnically cleanse those areas of Armenian residents. So what they want is they want to force Armenia to sign away any right, anything that is in support of establishing the rights of those people not to be essentially ethnically cleansed or have genocide committed against them. And for that purpose, they've started these aggressions, while at the same time, I think, given the force balance difference right now, they're trying to create this Gazification, which is that they can, at will, attack once every couple of months to constantly keep this issue going. Because fundamentally, despite the fact that the peaceful settlement of this issue benefits, obviously, Armenia, it benefits, frankly, most of the world, and it benefits, obviously, the Azeri people, and that is not at the benefit of the state. The keeping this aggression, keeping this foreign enemy going, is something that is critical to the survival of the current regime in Baku. So this is all driven by internal purposes and long-term strategic goals of having an ethnically cleansed Artsakh back in full Azeri control, which, by the way, has never been under Azeri control, because during Soviet times, that area was an autonomous republic. So they're not recovering anything. They're essentially gaining something that they've never actually had full authority over. So
sorry,
I think
you mean that during the Soviet period, it was an autonomous region within the Azeri Soviet Republic.
It was the Karabakh area was an autonomous republic, and then the Soviet system, obviously this is an Arab outlet, and you've seen the sort of the Western border drawing, which were essentially designed to cause all kinds of problems, and set up these landmines. And during the early Soviet period, and this was actually done by Stalin personally, they have created, there was no reason for that region that was predominantly Armenian to be put into the Azerbaijan Republic.
And
they
Stalin
created,
at the time being the Commissar of Nationalities in the Soviet
Union. This was a time bomb that it is still paying off for certain people. And causing unnecessary conflict between people who, frankly, have a lot more in common and have no reason to be enemies.
And when you say Gazification, do you also mean that these attacks can happen at will with the world looking the other way and not really
exactly? So it becomes routine, and if you see the coverage, instead of saying that Armenia's territorial territories have been attacked, what you will see is the typical border clashes and incursions, or disputed this or disputed that, and it gets reduced to what I call, in the minds of the Western press, is these what I call the disputes between brown people, in which if they were only as organized or nice or as sane as Europeans, you wouldn't have these things. So it's that attitude. And that actually serves the aggressor in this case.
Going back to Azeri objectives, in your view, is Baku out to basically impose its will by might making right, or is it seeking a formal Armenian capitulation in terms of a treaty or peace agreement?
Both. It's to use the current military imbalance to impose an unjust peace. And as we know,
so they do actually want a diplomatic settlement in their favor, and not just to kind of unilaterally redraw the borders.
Yes, but the issue is there's a great deal of doubt among, let's say, if you sign something and you finalize it, given that the continuation of the conflict is in the regime interest, if that would actually ended it. See, that's the $64,000 question. You could actually have a formal end, and then the parts of Armenia that they're currently occupying, they might not leave. Because who's going to make them leave unless there's another conflict, or Armenia is at some point strong enough to make them leave. So yes, they want to impose their will in an unjust peace, and get their way while they have the upper hand, which is logical as far as just the cynical politics of it. But in reality, what we've learned in this conflict is maximalist victories do not bring peace. What you need is a peace that is disliked by both sides. And maximalist victories, what they bring is another war 20, 30 years later when the balance of forces change. And if, for example, the Aliyev regime actually achieves its goal of ethnic cleansing, the world's a dynamic place. 20, 30 years from now, Armenia is developing very strongly, especially in the IT sector and on the economic front. And Azerbaijan, the state, given its mismanagement of its oil resources, which is quite common in the area, frankly, it's quite common in all oil-producing states, might have a situation where this power relationship entirely reverses itself in 10 or 15 years. So what the world needs to impose here is a peace that doesn't satisfy either side and does not lead to this kind of a maximalist victory, because maximalist victories breed revanchism, and revanchism breeds war.
Yeah. And I'd like to return back to a point you were raising earlier about the dispensation of these territories during the early Soviet period. And since the final years of the Soviet Union and throughout the post-Soviet period, Armenian-Azeri relations, as you've noted, have been dominated by competing claims over Nagorno-Karabakh, also known as Artsakh. And this included a full-scale armed conflict in 2020, in
Two
which
of them actually,
thousands-
one in the early 90s, which was won by
Yes.
Armenia, and the second one in 2020, which was won by Azerbaijan and Turkey.
Right. And what are the main elements of this dispute? And given what you just said about the international community imposing a resolution, where do things stand in terms of achieving?
I have no idea. I mean, as far as what the negotiations are, I have no idea because we're not in the back rooms, and obviously things that they discuss are not for public view. The bottom line is this is the fundamental problem. There are plenty of people that live, minorities that live in other countries. It's quite common. In fact, the southern part of the Georgian Republic is predominantly Armenian. But however, there's no separatist movement. There's no movement for that area to join Armenia or anything like that at all. And the reason for that is simple, because the Georgian state is not interested in both ethnically cleansing Armenians of their traditional homes in Georgia or destroying their cultural heritage, which is actually a huge issue because there's a systematic cultural genocide that's being implemented by the Aliyev regime and also falsification of history, which is
confirmed in a number of recent prominent international reports.
Yeah, I mean, they'll take Armenian churches that go back, or monasteries that go back thousands of years, and they'll claim this was built by some imaginary people that never existed. And part of it, frankly, is because of the basic insecurities of the Aliyev regime's narrative, is because Azerbaijan is a new country. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with being a new country. Jordan is a new country. Dubai is a new country, and they're surrounded by all these ancient civilizations, whether it's Iran to the south, whether it's Armenia and Georgia, or even to the north, the Russian Slavic civilization goes back 1,000 years. So they have these silly insecurities, which is not just Aliyev himself, however, unfortunately. And I think this is where a lot of this sort of the cultural genocide thing comes from. They have no reason to be insecure. People have a right, to have their own stories, whether it's new or old. There's nothing. Armenia is not superior in any way over any other country because we go back a long time. So I think that this is a very touching thing with Armenians as far as this falsification of history and the destruction of cultural monuments. In fact, actually, worldwide, just in the sheer number of monuments destroyed, the Aliyev regime has actually destroyed far more monuments, for example, than the Taliban ever did, or even ISIS. So this is a very systematic effort to falsify history. So I think the issue is this: if you have a people, let's say the entire world recognizes Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan. Let's just say take that as let's take that as the principled position. The issue becomes, does that regime have a right, a legal right, to ethnically cleanse those people out of these territories that they've lived on?
In other words, does sovereignty
override,
endow a right to ethnically cleanse a territory?
And according to international law, it does not. In fact, according to international law, if you were to claim that Artsakh should be entirely the territory of Azerbaijan, the responsibility of protecting the Armenians of Azerbaijan is actually in the hands of the Aliyev regime first. But beyond that, the international community, if the intent is genocidal, has a legal right, actually a responsibility to act to protect those people from being ethnically cleansed. That's the crux of the issue. Obviously, there are creative ways to come up with solutions to this, but that is unfortunately not what the current regime in Baku is interested in. They want ethnic cleansing, and they want it now. And any kind of a formula that you come up with in which Armenians will be ruled by Aliyev's regime, they will not stay there, or they will be forced out, or in the most drastic cases, you will have a second Srebrenica on the European continent in 30 years. That is there's actually no group of people in the world today that are at a greater risk of genocide than the Armenians of Artsakh.
And what do you make of the Azeri claims that when Armenia or Armenians within Nagorno-Karabakh managed to establish their control over that area in 1991, they then also occupied a number of villages outside the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh and ethnically cleansed those of their Azeri residents.
Yeah, that's true. However, there's a context to that, and there's a story behind it. Obviously, the whole purpose of that was that you take those territories and you will trade them in a political deal, and that will either create independence or self-rule for the Armenians of Artsakh in exchange for the return of those territories. And there were two specific cases in 2001 in Key West, Florida, in which Aliyev's dad actually agreed to that deal, and actually provided a sovereign access road to the exclave of Nakhchivan for Azerbaijan in exchange for Artsakh, the proper parts of Artsakh, the Soviet parts, to become either independent or to join Armenia.
Sorry, just to clarify, Nakhchivan is a Azeri enclave separated from
by Armenian territory.
By Armenian territory.
Yeah.
And one of the issues has been finding a formula for access between these two. Yeah.
Yes. So that was a deal in 2001. So this issue, his dad agreed to this deal, and the talk always has been, obviously, I can't confirm this, is that when he went back to Baku, he was talked out of it by his son because the father was ill and the son was going to be taken over soon. Now, for whatever reason, I can imagine that the reason he did that is because for a regime like his that ultimately cannot deliver the goods to its people, this external enemy is quite useful. Or he, on principle, disapproved of it. But this was agreed to on the Armenian side, which means that the Armenian side the Artsakh side was willing to return all of these occupied territories 20 years ago, which means all of these people who had to leave could have come back 20 years ago. And in 2011, there was a deal in Kazan in which Armenia accepted a lower level, i.e. not independence of status for Artsakh. And
this
again,
was under Russian mediation.
2011, yes, the OSCE, in which, again, it was rejected by the other side, because I think ultimately the regime's goals have always been a returned ethnically cleansed Artsakh to Azeri control, regardless of what the world says. That's always been their concern. And in fact, he has said that in so many ways. This is not a secret. He, in fact, over the last year has complained that the Russian-controlled areas, people are not being driven out fast enough. So that's always been that's always been the intent. So the issue for the international community is, does this regime have a right to do something that you do not give to any other regime in Europe? That's the crux of the situation. This is a solvable issue. If the intent of the Azeri regime is not the ethnic cleansing of Armenians in areas that they've lived in for thousands of years, if that's their program, then it is not a solvable issue. Because even if they achieve that, that will create a political framework in which we will have 2 more generations of war.
Permanent conflict.
Yes.
Yeah. Before turning to the more regional and international dynamics involved here, I'd like to raise an issue that's been very much in the news in recent days, which is the release of a video that appears to show Azeri soldiers summarily executing a number of Armenian prisoners of war. There was obviously a political motive behind the release of this video. It doesn't appear to have been leaked against the will of Baku. And perhaps you could also explain how this fits into not only the broader political context, but also specifically the propaganda war that's being fought out.
Well, it's terrorism. I mean, the object is to terrorize people. To terrorize people in Artsakh that are surrounded on all sides by Azeri troops. That this is your fate. It's very clear. There's not too many regimes in the world that would commit war crimes, and executing POWs, ISIS style, is a war crime. Deliberately. I mean, it's almost bizarre in a way. They're actually bragging about it. But it is an attempt to terrorize a population and to send a message that this is your fate. However, as you know, these kinds of things never work because they usually have the opposite effect. because when you see your compatriots executed in that style, what kind of a peace can you have with that regime? And it strengthens everybody in this country that believes that this is a existential war against the genocidal regime. So if the intent is to intimidate, yeah, I'm sure it intimidates some, but it angers a lot more and activates a lot more people. But I think the other thing, I think, which I want to be very clear about this, there were soldiers who did this execution, and obviously they should be held responsible. But they're just a puppet in this game. There's one man who did that execution, and he's in Baku. He leads that country, and he is gladly accepted all over the West and all over Europe as a respectable statesman. What these soldiers did is what they have learned is acceptable based on 30 years of hatred and very ugly racist propaganda that has made it possible for them to act like that. So I do not, these soldiers have to answer to their conscience or answer to the God that they believe in. That's up to them. But as far as a political responsibility,
there's command responsibility.
Yes, it's the command responsibility and the culture that you set. This was sort of coming, in 2000, there was a case in a NATO training exercise in Hungary, in which there were Armenian Azeri troops present. And there was an Azeri officer that beheaded an Armenian officer while he was sleeping with an axe.
This was during a training exercise. So
this person got in life.
It was not an armed conflict in the Caucasus.
No, it was a training exercise. And that person was sleeping. So this person was given a life sentence in Hungary based on some corrupt deal. They paid the Orban regime to free him with the promise that he was going to go to jail in Azerbaijan and spend his time in jail. And he was greeted at the airport by the president. He was given an apartment, his back pay, and a promotion. So when your national hero is an axe murderer and the president is the one who declares him a hero, what can you say about that?
Well, it rings bells of what you earlier called the Gazification of Armenia. Eric, I'd now like to turn towards the regional and international dimensions of this conflict. During the 2020 war, Azerbaijan received significant support from regional allies, particularly Turkey and Israel. Armenia's international partners, often identified as Russia and Iran, were by contrast notable for their absence. So what is the broader regional context at play here? And does this help explain the timing of the recent Azeri attack? And here one can point particularly perhaps to the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's preoccupation with that on the one hand, and Iran's domestic difficulties and the continuing negotiations over renewal of the Iranian nuclear
deal. First of all, I think we have to step back. There's no such thing as an Armenian-Iranian alliance. That really doesn't exist. There was a formal Armenian-Russian alliance, or Armenia was part of CSTO, which is the sort of poor man's NATO, the Russian version of it, in which Russia is responsible to come to Armenia's aid if it's attacked, especially Armenia proper is attacked, which they have not done.
Sorry, if I could just interrupt. If I'm not mistaken, in 2020, Russia indicated that it did not come to Armenia's aid because the conflict played out outside Armenia's internationally recognized borders. But this year, even though the Azeri attacks took place within those borders, Russia also spring into action.
Yeah, they have, interestingly enough, in this case, them and the EU have taken these really immoral positions about not calling out the aggressor. And actually the only country that's actually called out the aggressor is the United States, which is rather, the world turned upside down. So I think that let's go back on the Iranian thing. I think that's people always say that, but there's no such thing as an alliance. I think they're not enemies, but an alliance is an exaggeration. I think the Ukraine war has destabilized, it's destabilized the whole world. And it's destabilized this conflict because the world's attention is distracted, Russia is distracted. And it is an opportunity seen by the regime in Baku, especially given the balance of forces, to be aggressive in pushing its political agenda in a far faster timeline than it normally would have. Because the truth of the matter is, everyone knows when the Russians came that they were never going to leave. Because traditionally when the Russians go anywhere, they don't leave. And it was thought that no Azeri regime would ever actually dare to ask them to leave because they could just not leave. That is no longer the case because of what's going on in Ukraine. So the Ukraine situation has actually destabilized this part of the world, and in fact, it's destabilized a good part of the world. So there's a direct link with the sort of the world order coming apart because of the Ukraine war and this current round of aggressions.
Going further into the Russian-American international angle, if you will, as you know, Russia's been a constant presence in the Caucasus, but until recently, the region was generally ignored by the United States, and that appears to be changing now with the recent visit to Armenia by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi being a prominent example. Apart from the pros and cons of these visits and so on, is Armenia at risk of falling prey to Russian-American competition, as was the case in Georgia and currently, more recently, Ukraine?
Certainly, that's a certain possibility, because both sides are taking maximalist positions. So not just Armenia, every country, in fact, the smaller you are, the more threatened you are, is put in a vice to choose between sides that you don't necessarily want to choose between. But I think the broader lesson here is that the United States is seeing a vacuum and is trying to fill it. And I think there's a couple of things that were shattered because of the last round of Aliyev's attacks onto sovereign Armenian territory, and one of them was the Armenian myth that the Russians was an ally that can defend you, or actually was willing to defend you. And what we have learned is actually there's a sort of a tactical alliance between Russia, Turkey, and Aliyev's state against the West in general, or in this case, the United States. So I think this allowed the United States to step in very smartly, I might say, because this is something that was entirely missed by Europeans. The Europeans would have been far better off calling this aggression for what it was, and they have just been the most weaselly worded, people you can imagine, taking completely amoral stances as far as clearly calling out facts for what they are. And I think the United States is seeing an opportunity to flip Armenia. And if you know the map of the Caucasus, if Armenia becomes a pro-Western country, then Russia will be pushed out of the Caucasus for the first time in 200 years. Because they have no presence in Georgia, and they're not a positive one. They have the presence in Artsakh right now. But this is like a coup de grace. If the United States can pull this off, Russians get essentially pushed out of an area in their backyard where they've been the predominant power for 200 years. So I think the Americans just tactically, it doesn't matter morally, tactically saw an opportunity, which the Europeans entirely fumbled, and the Russians fumbled by not being more forceful. and they're seeing an opportunity and they're taking advantage of it. Is it risky? Well, of course it's risky.
And what are, I mean, the consequences for both Russia and the United States are clear. What are the risks for Armenia?
Well, I mean, all the countries in this region are flies, for the purposes of the United States or Russia. The Russian influence in Armenia is great. Most of our gas comes from there. Most of our trade happens with them. So Russia will always be a player here. But what has disappeared is that the entire pro-Russian political stance in Armenia has collapsed. And those people who were pro-Russia or are constantly criticizing this government for being not pro-Russia enough have really nothing to say. So, but the risks are huge. I mean, we don't know what's happening with the Russian leadership. They could, very well try to make an example of any country that tries to get out of their shadow, which they think is part of their world, and act in countless different ways. So it is a risky situation, but at the same time, their lack of action has essentially convinced everyone here that this country needs to be that move in another direction, multiple directions, all at the same time. It's not a question of necessity; it's a question of necessity at this point.
Yeah. And now that we've spoken about the Russians and the Americans, you've also briefly alluded to the Europeans, and we have seen the EU leadership, Ursula von der Leyen and others, practically in the same breath, condemning Russia for for its invasion of Ukraine, and then lauding the government in Baku and its leader Aliyev for agreeing to increase gas supplies to Europe and lauding him as a valued partner.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's there's two things there actually, because one of the things is it's important to point this out. This gas deal is more fantasy than reality, is because if you look at the capacity of the Azeri oil and gas resources, which by the way have peaked and are declining over the next many years. At best, they can go from 1% of European use daily to 2%. And you've compared this to countries like Algeria and other places, or LNG from Qatar or LNG from the United States is minuscule. So this is a bit of politicking by a very desperate EU leadership to show that they're building alternatives, while at the same time emboldening some of the worst actors in the world. So I think that gas thing is more fantasy than reality. But I remember there was a summit in Indonesia in which the EU foreign minister Borrell was complaining that the global South is on the Russian side and not on the European side, and that the Europe has lost the global South. Well, yes, but it's precisely because of issues like this. You cannot have a standard where people should care about Ukraine and not care about Yemen, when EU members are essentially empowering the starvation of 8 million people, or Western powers specifically, very much the UK actually, or the aggressions of a regime like Aliyev's on a democratic state. So I can't call it anything but hypocrisy, and I have no sympathy for Miss van der Leyen or Borrell and all the rest of them, is because they're frankly entirely insincere.
Finally, Eric, I'd like to turn to the domestic situation in Armenia. And you've alluded to this a little bit, but recent events appear to have further increased opposition to Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who, depending on your perspective, is said to be either responsible for recent Armenian losses, or alternatively is the heir to a state made incapable of defending its interests by his predecessors. What is the current domestic situation within Armenia, and how do you expect it to play out?
Well, yes, and I think both of those charges are correct. He's guilty of one, and then the second one is true, as far as what he inherited. The domestic situation is such in which you have a prime minister who started off with almost universal approval, and that has been shrinking every month as is.
Sorry, this was in 2018, if I'm not mistaken.
2018. Yeah, 2018. He was probably at 80%. Now he's probably in the mid 30s. But in a parliamentary system, mid 30s is actually quite strong, as you know, because of the way the seats get allotted. And the formal opposition to him in parliament that got elected right after the war is exactly the most discredited figures from the former regime. There is, the next time there are elections, or if there's a major crisis, what you're real likely to see is a third force. And that third force is going to be essentially people who supported the revolution and have been disappointed by the competence or the prime minister's ability to run the country, or actually precisely to defend the country. And if you look at polling demographically, those are the younger, better educated, the more, they're not necessarily the majority, but as you know, in every society, and not every faction is equal. And I think if there's another election, there's going to be a third force that would be people who were for the revolution, but are younger, more affluent, and want a more competent government. If you actually look at the current government's base, ironically, it's very much the Erdogan base across the border, or the Orban base in Hungary, despite the fact that Pashinyan himself is frankly far more liberal than both of them as far as not being authoritarian. Now, he's not perfect, but he's no way, he's not an Erdogan, he's not an Orban, but the political bases are the same. His political base is rural, older, and poor, who stands by him for many different reasons, which are complicated, but understandable. And who he has lost is the urban middle classes, the younger people, and people in the IT sector, which have a vastly overrepresented importance in this country. Because it is seen as the future. It's where all the best paying jobs are. And in fact, I was reading some interesting statistics. Outside of the state of California, there's no country that has more people in IT per 100,000 than Armenia, anywhere in the world. So those are the people that are going to come out and become the actual opposition, not the discredited old figures that have very little credibility.
Though such aspirations often don't materialize in reality, and you either get a perpetuation of the existing regime or a revival of the previous one.
Yes, I think this is, and I'm going to tell you, is almost paradoxical. I mean, it's just one of the, to live in Armenia today has its absurdist elements. At the same time, where the country has been more insecure than it's ever been since 1991. You have an economy that is the #1 growth rate in Europe. Probably the only currency that has gained against the dollar by a factor of 20 to 25%. Has a labor shortage, has people flying in from other countries to work here. So you have this schizophrenic situation in which you have serious security issues, while for the first time in 30 years, the country seems to have turned an economic corner. So it's, which, by the way, as you know, we're always talking in the terms of weeks and days. In the long run, that's what matters. Obviously, you cannot continue that if you have continued insecurity, because at some point the two meet and they collapse each other. But this is, it is a country that is, economically doing much better than almost any other country in Europe, and has actually benefited from the brain drain from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. We're
particularly in recent months.
In recent months, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to Armenia, but Armenia used to be very monocultural, and now probably, a third of all the people in central Yerevan are not Armenian.
Yep. Eric Hacopian, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights on this first episode of the new season of Connections. It was great having you.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for having me.